Hey, so episode 10, we are almost done with our little revision series on authoritarian leaders. This is going to be the second to last episode for Castro. We are going to focus on this part of the IB guide right here: aims and results of policies, particularly, went the wrong way, particularly targeting political, cultural, social, economic policies and those impact on of the policies on women and minorities. Here we go. Political policies. I mentioned one or two episodes ago about how Castro promised to bring the 1940 Constitution back. It took him some time. It took a little bit of time, but he got there. In 1976, he's going to release the newest version of the Cuban Constitution that is going to outline Castro as the head of state as well as the head of the Communist Party. It is going to firmly declare Cuba as a single party state, and that single party is the Communist Party. It's also going to have some super positive stuff that guarantees things like education and healthcare to all Cuban peoples, including women in that. So we'll get to that in a minute. On some negative parts, only members of the Communist Party could work in different levels of the Cuban government. So there are some positives and negatives about that Constitution of 76. Economic policies. We're talking about sugar again. All right. Talked about it in the foreign policy element of it, a little bit of an overlap there, but Castro is going to nationalize the Cuban sugar economy. So that's going to be good for Cuba in terms of generating a little bit more money and putting that money in the hands of the public and out of U.S. corporations. He's going to inherit a very, very, very weak economic situation. Cuba is not a very modernized country, like many of its Latin American counterparts at the time. The dependency on U.S. trade was really apparent once he took over. He's got a huge lack of skilled workers. Many of those skilled workers were pro-U.S., right? They were the middle management. They were in the pocket of the United States. And when the Batista regime is going to crumble, a lot of those skilled workers are going to flee, which is a major brain drain on the country. He does institute agricultural reforms very shortly after he takes over that breaks up that kind of Spanish feudal plantation system that was going on there. He is going to implement different types of government programs and government assistance to make housing and rent more affordable for all Cubans. So positive there. He does take a shot at diversification, which we're going to talk about in another couple minutes, to try and bring a wider range of industries and production into Cuba. Doesn't really go that well. Part of that is the 10 million ton harvest, which was a huge propaganda campaign to get more production out of Cuban agricultural sectors, and it's a failure. They don't hit 10 million tons. I don't even think they hit half that. All right. Some more economic policies. If we go back to like the notes, you can get these a little bit more spelled out. Rectification is that attempt to modernize Cuba a little bit more, to diversify the portfolio, if you will, of the Cuban economy. Again, doesn't really work out. Austerity. This is going to come in like the 80s, right? We talked about how they go from one dependency to another dependency, from the U.S. to the USSR, as the Cold War is starting to take a toll on the Soviet pocket, right after the invasion of Afghanistan, and the money that the Soviets had to pour into that, and Chernobyl, and all of that other stuff that diverted a lot of funds from the Soviet Union. Castro's going to go through it a little bit. Cuba's going to go through it a little bit. Their national debt is going to climb pretty astronomically, because they are going to have to get some of those resources they were either incredibly dependent on the Soviet Union for, or receiving at a very discounted rate from the Soviet Union. They're going to have to look elsewhere to get it, and that's a really bad economic situation for the Cubans, and that's going to lead to the special period, which is post or during collapse of the Soviet Union. It's going to lead lead to a crazy shortage of energy, food, oil, severe rationing of all of those things across the board, right? We talked about it in class. Cubans were encouraged to do things like take their bicycle to work because they couldn't run their cars anymore. Social policies. These are a little bit more of a positive light, right? The literacy campaigns are part of these social policies. When Castro took over, Cuba was one of the most illiterate countries in the world, especially that eastern part of the country. Now it's among one of the most literate countries in the world with some of the highest literacy rates. So those literacy campaigns were huge for the development of Cuba, and that free access to education for all was pretty positive, right? Another part of it in that 76 Constitution was healthcare, right? Guaranteed to all citizens in 76, women included, which we'll get to again in a second. Now Cuba has one of the best doctor to patient rate or doctor to civilian ratios in the world. Cuba is going to send doctors out, right? We talked about during the Ebola outbreak in Africa, the United States sends soldiers to Africa and Cuba sends doctors to Africa. So the social policies benefited Cubans tremendously. Treatment of women. Here's a stark difference between Nazi Germany and Cuban society, right? Again, the Cuban society doesn't really treat women all that different than they used to, but the government tried to make improvements to women, right? Gender equality is a major focal point of the Cuban government. Literacy campaigns, women have access to those literacy campaigns. They have access to education. They have access to health care, including feminine health care, like maternal care when they're pregnant, both pre and post partum. So that's huge. That's great. That's progressive for the time, right? The 1975 Family Code tries to break down some of those gender roles and tries to convince men that, hey, if you've got a kid or you've got house chores, you could take care of those things too, freeing up the women so that they can join the economy. All right. I think I've got to move my stuff here a little bit so you can see everything. Let me drag. Let me do this. Here we go. Treatment of Black Cubans. Not great. Not a lot done from the government to try and improve the plight of a Black Cuban or an Afro-Cuban at this time. They still have a pretty bad, pretty impoverished reality in Cuba. Homosexuals are going to be part of the UMAPs, which are like military camps. For a part of Cuban history, you were arrested for being gay. It was a crime. That's going to end in the 60s. So from a governmental standpoint, they stopped with the prosecution of gay people. But from a societal standpoint, that's going to continue. Jehovah's Witnesses are also going to be brought into those UMAPs, those camps, those forced work camps. Religion in Cuba is a real hard line to follow because obviously being a former Spanish colony, religion is a major part of Cuban society. However, religion is not really wanted in a communist society, so they had to walk that line, right? They had to allow kind of religious freedom, Catholic freedom, Christian freedom, not really freedom for other groups. They had to be tolerant of that religion even within the government, but they also didn't want people to be overly religious within the Communist Party. So they really had to walk a fine line there. Next and last episode, we're going to get into a little bit of historiography about Castro. Hope these help. I'll see you guys in episode 11.